recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Health said that the current minimum standard in Saskatchewan senior care facilities is just 1 bath per week. But then he went on to say, quote, "We know that sometimes that's not the case, though. Sometimes it will be longer than a week, but that may depend in some cases on staffing," end quote. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's exactly the point we've been making through this legislative session when it comes to the care for seniors here in the province. Our grandparents deserve better than what they have been receiving because of the short staffing situations that have been created by the Sask party government. The government's response, Mr. Speaker, are CEO tours to tour the facilities. But by the minister's own quote, his minister's own remarks yesterday, we know what the problem is. We know that it's short staffing that is causing situations where the level of care is not as high as it needs to be. My question to the Premier, when the economy is doing well, why won't he just mandate 2 baths per week for seniors? Why won't he address the issue of chronic understaffing in care facilities? Mr. Speaker, if the minister thinks it's acceptable for a senior who is confined to the bed to have a bath every 9 days, I think the Sask Party's approach in seniors' care is increasingly out of touch with what Saskatchewan people and families expect for their loved ones. Speaker, we know that short staffing is causing problems for seniors' care here in the province. That's what individuals like Carrie Clausen have told us when they've come to the legislature. Throughout this session, Mr. Speaker, we have in many instances stood up and we've spoken out on issues where the government is off track, when they're headed in the wrong direction. And seniors' care is one example of that. But we've also been constructive in our approach, Mr. Speaker, seeking ways to better the future, to better the situation for Saskatchewan people. And one example of that is the work that we've been able to do on Howard's Law. And though the Sask Party initially rejected and was not willing to support this legislation, I'm pleased that they came around to supporting it, and I do thank the Premier and I thank the government members for their support on that. I wish, however, that we would see that same cooperative approach on Howard's Law with respect to Bill 85 and the labour legislation that we've seen. We, as an opposition, Mr. Speaker, have offered to be constructive. We have extended an olive branch in actually working with the Sask Party to fix many of the deficiencies in the legislation and to allow the proper consultation with Saskatchewan people to occur. The government has rejected that offer, and now we look at the regulations. My question to the Premier, how will the Premier ensure that the appropriate consultation occurs with the regulations with respect to 85, especially with the underutilization of the Minister's Advisory Committee? Speaker, we've also been constructive coming forward on the areas of diversity, equality, and human rights. And it's for that reason, Mr. Speaker, after I was appointed leader, that I appointed the member from Saskatoon Centre as our critic in this important area. And I also brought forward a suggestion to the government that they post some information on their ministry website about the benefits of gay-straight alliances in our schools and how this can serve to protect students and ensure that we have a healthy learning environment for everyone. And I hate the thought, Mr. Speaker, of a student who wakes up in the morning and is fearful to go to school because they are gay. That is simply not acceptable in Saskatchewan, and we all have a responsibility to ensure all students are safe. Although the Premier initially rejected the idea of putting it on the website, I am pleased that it is now on the website because this is simply the right thing to do. But I'm concerned about the Premier's initial reaction when this was raised in the Assembly, because he sought to exploit the divisions in the province as opposed to considering the safety of all students. And I'm hugely concerned about the message that that sends to LGBT youth here in the province, especially those who are being bullied, especially those who are out in their schools. So my question to the Premier, having taken that initial approach that's one of division as opposed to safety for students, how does he intend to heal the divisions that he sought to exploit in his initial response? The consensus in the province when it comes to education, especially in the last budget, is that the Sask Party government is falling well short in the area of education. In response to the budget, the STF said it was, quote, much ado about nothing. In response to the budget, the SSBA said that, quote, the provincial budget fails to recognize education's role in continued prosperity, end quote. And we think of the situation in the Battlefords, Mr. Speaker, where the students were forced to learn in their coats because of the budget constraints and the pressures that the division had. My question to the Premier, when the economy is doing well, how on earth is it acceptable to have these situations here in the province?
Mr.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 24 months, whenever we've raised the issue of First Nations and Métis employment and education, what the Premier has proudly talked about is the work of the task force that they created. Right. On many occasions, members on those benches have talked about the importance of the task force and the qualified individuals that are serving on it. And, Mr. Speaker, I would say that it is important work, and I would say that those individuals are indeed very qualified and have a lot to share. But last week we learned, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier will be ignoring at least one of the key recommendations from that task force, and that is the recommendation to provide interim funding to provincial school divisions to reduce tuition costs charged to First Nations educational authorities. By the Premier's own remarks and Premier's estimates, this would be a cost of $3.4 million. But in his remarks, Mr. Speaker, there's been uncertainty as to whether or not the Premier actually understands the detail and what recommendation number 4 means. So my question to the Premier, is he confused about the detail of this recommendation? Why is he rejecting it? And how many other recommendations from the task force does he plan to simply ignore?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
You know, Mr. Speaker, they put the words down on paper, but when we see only $3 million with the task force, when we see the Premier unwilling to say which other recommendations he will be ignoring, that is not reassuring to Saskatchewan people, especially when they say the task force is so important. We've seen that same similar dismissive approach on so many topics. It's the track record of this government in this session. One of the most glaring examples are the government's interactions with the provincial auditor, the independent provincial auditor. Right. When the provincial auditor came out with a report saying that the government has it wrong in maintaining 2 sets of books, that they are hiding deficits, that they are masking the true amount of the debt. What do we have from the government? What do they say? Oh, well, every other jurisdiction in the country has it wrong, but we have it right. And then we see their behaviour in committee, Mr. Speaker. We see the members of the government being confrontational, being disrespectful, and completely unacceptable behaviour with the provincial auditor. And the member from Moose Jaw is already heckling from his seat, just like he did in committee with the provincial auditor, Mr. Speaker. I asked the Premier if he thought that behaviour was acceptable in estimates, and he did not reply. Does the Premier condone the behaviour of his members? Continued dismissive approach when it comes to the provincial auditor, just like we've seen on so many other fronts. The worst example I think we saw of this dismissive approach, this disrespectful approach, occurred when Jennifer Burns and Devin were here in the Assembly. When the Minister of Crown Investments went out into the rotunda 5-6 feet away from Jennifer Burns and said that she wasn't telling the truth. On that day, Jennifer Burns said, quote, that the minister's actions were, quote, disgusting. She just recently sent me this email, and it says, quote, not only was my family incredibly offended by the claims made by Ms. Harpower in the rotunda, we felt disrespected and we felt belittled. The conduct of Ms. Harpower in the rotunda was unacceptable. However, when accountability was requested, it was absent. My family no longer finds this surprising. Given the fact that not once were our questions answered during question period we attended, I challenge the Wall government to take accountability, apologize to my brother and my family, and for once just tell the truth, end quote. My question to the Premier, will he apologize to Devin? Will he apologize to Jennifer and the Burns family? And will he admit the information that his government was spreading about the Burns family was not correct?